Today is the day of the important business meeting with a top tire company that will determine the fate of our company. I have to make this deal a success together with Mr. Johnson. I had been preparing and compiling documents for this day, but just as the deal was about to be finalized, Mr. Johnson uttered a shocking statement to Mr. Thompson, the CEO of the other company. "This guy's incompetent, so I'll take over from here." For a moment, I couldn't believe my ears. Mr. Johnson had made no preparations for this meeting, yet he was trying to steal the credit for my work. I absolutely won't let that happen. As I was thinking this, Mr. Thompson took a surprising action, and Mr. Johnson ended up receiving a harsh punishment. My name is Zach, and I'm 27 years old. I currently work in the sales department of an electronic components company. I started working right after graduating high school. When people hear I'm a high school graduate, my former classmates who knew me back then are surprised. That's because my grades were second to none. My family consisted of just my mother and me, and it would be an overstatement to call our circumstances well off. When I was a student, we couldn't even afford school lunch fees. My mother desperately juggled multiple part-time jobs to raise me, so she was often not at home. But I wasn't lonely. That's because my uncle's family, who lived nearby, always looked after me. My uncle, my mother's older brother, was more than 10 years older than her and had no children, so he doted on me like his own child. He would invite me over for dinner and sometimes come to my house to play with me. My uncle was an admirable person who seemed radiant to me back then. I even started thinking that I wanted to become an upstanding person like my uncle in the future, someone who could protect my mother. So I mustered up my courage and asked him how I could become like him. My uncle replied with a serious expression, "Study hard and become smart. The more you study, the smarter you'll become. Studying will never betray you, Zach." From then on, I started putting effort into studying. That said, my family couldn't afford to send me to cram school, so I studied on my own. As I continued studying, I became able to achieve the top grades in my year. As studying became enjoyable, I started wanting to study even more and considered going to college. However, I didn't want to cause my mother any more trouble. When it came time to think about my future path in my 4th year of high school, I made the decision to find employment after graduating. But my uncle strongly opposed this choice of mine. He said that if I liked studying, I should go to college. "I'll pay for everything, so you go to college, Zach." My uncle tried to persuade me, saying this, but I didn't want to trouble even my uncle, who had always been so kind to me. It was with this sole thought in mind that I didn't go to college. Besides, I could continue studying on my own even after finding a job. I had no regrets about this decision. I found employment in sales at a company dealing with electrical equipment, which I had been interested in for a while. There were a few other high school graduates, and it was a pleasant workplace where we could work in a friendly atmosphere. Every day was fulfilling and enjoyable, but then it suddenly happened. The company was abruptly going to be absorbed in a merger with another company. It was so sudden that everything went dark before my eyes, but us employees were told we could continue working without quitting, which was a relief. However, that relief was short-lived, and what awaited me was a hell I never could have imagined. On the first day of work after the merger, I headed to the office feeling nervous. With this merger, my bosses changed all at once. The members I work with will probably change completely too, but I thought we'd be able to work in a friendly atmosphere like before. However, when I entered the office, I was surprised. The office was dead silent, totally different from the atmosphere before. Then, my colleague Wilson, who I'd been working with for a while, called out to me. Wilson is the same age as me, and we're close enough to go out drinking together. Wilson joined a company as a college graduate and is 4 years older than me, but he's so friendly you wouldn't even feel that age gap. This seems to be the seating chart. Mr. Johnson said we need to sit according to this. I took the paper from him. It neatly listed who would sit where. The new director, Mr. Johnson, must be a meticulous guy to make a seating chart. He's probably a really put-together person. Thinking this, I moved to my own desk. My seat was right by the entrance. Then Wilson told me something surprising. Apparently this seating chart is arranged by educational background. What? I looked at the seating chart. Sure enough, The desks of my colleagues, who were high school graduates like me, were all clustered by the entrance. As I stood there dumbfounded, Wilson opened his mouth heavily. Seems there aren't any high school graduate new hires in the company we merged with. Mr. Johnson is apparently the type to judge people based on their academic background. I couldn't believe my ears. If Mr. Johnson judges people based on education, then as a high school graduate, I'm screwed, aren't I? I suddenly became anxious. I hope this anxiety of mine was just needless worry, but fate is cruel. My fears ended up being realized. As soon as Mr. Johnson entered the office, he gathered all the employees to introduce himself. The employees from the old company probably know, but I'm Johnson. I joined this company as an elite after graduating from a famous university. I'm smart. I thought he was intense. I've never met a boss who calls himself an elite and smart. I listened to him talk, still in a daze. Mr. Johnson continued. The hiring requirement for the pre-merger company was a college degree or higher, but now we've ended up working together with these high school graduate folks after the merger. I'm truly sorry to the college graduate employees. High school grads are inherently incompetent, after all. My high school graduate colleagues and I exchanged glances. There's no need to say something like that in front of everyone, and to treat people as incompetent when you haven't even worked with them yet. What kind of nerve does he have? I trembled with anger. Then Mr. Johnson glared at us high school graduates and yelled loudly, "Hey, you lot. Don't cause trouble for the other employees. If I think you're even a little bit of a nuisance, you are fired." Fired? I was so appalled I couldn't even speak. A boss shouldn't use words like that so lightly. Mr. Johnson is going to be my boss from now on. Will I really be able to get along with him? I was filled with nothing but anxiety. After that, everyone returned to their desks at once and started working. The job is still sales, same as before. The salespeople at this company also create the documents they use for sales themselves. These documents are indispensable for sales, essential for smoothly carrying out sales activities. As I was creating them, Mr. Johnson approached me. "Once you finish those documents, let me take a look." Mr. Johnson returned to his own desk after saying just that. Without thinking too deeply about it, I focused on creating the documents and finished them in 1 to 2 hours. All that's left is to go make sales for this company. Thinking this, I brought them to Mr. Johnson. Then Mr. Johnson started intently checking over those documents. When he finished checking, he told me, "All right, looks good." But he didn't return the documents I created to me. Finding this strange, I said to Mr. Johnson, I can't go make sales if you don't give those documents back to me," at which he burst out laughing. And then he said something utterly shocking to me that I never could have predicted. "You're a high school graduate, so sales is impossible for you. I'll have the other college graduate employees go." For a moment, I couldn't comprehend what I was being told. I've been working as a salesman until now, and I've achieved decent sales results. Despite that, making me just create documents and not letting me go make sales is way too cruel. Thinking this, I argued back to Mr. Johnson. "That's way too harsh. I may be a high school graduate, but I can do sales." At that, Mr. Johnson's face rapidly turned red and he got angry. "Who do you think you're talking back to? What I say is absolute. From today, you're in charge of document creation. It's a given that high school graduates are incompetent. If you don't like it, feel free to quit." Mr. Johnson's remark, which could be taken as a threat, caused an uproar in the office. Unbelievable. I was overcome with an indescribable anger, but I managed to stay calm somehow, gave a small reply, and returned to my desk. I can't believe I'm being made to just create documents when I joined the sales department wanting to do sales. I continued working, filled with those kinds of thoughts. When lunchtime came, I turned off my computer and headed to the convenience store. I always got my lunch at the convenience store. Then Wilson approached me. "Let's eat together, man." Wilson called out to me with a bright smile, even though I was feeling down. He was probably trying to cheer me up even a little. I was grateful from the bottom of my heart that even if I had the worst boss, I was blessed with good colleagues. I decided to buy lunch at the convenience store and eat with Wilson. As we were finishing our lunches, Wilson said something to me. "You're coming to the drinking party today, right?" "Huh? What are you talking about?" This was the first I'd heard of a drinking party. There's a drinking party for the sales department today. Mr. Johnson said it's to promote interaction between employees on the first day of the merger. I didn't hear about that. As I was confused by this thing I was hearing for the first time, Wilson pleaded with me. You know I'm shy around people I don't know well, right? I'll feel uneasy by myself. So you join too. Please. Well, if Wilson is going that far, I guess I'll participate. This drinking party might be a chance to get close to Mr. Johnson. Thinking this, I gave Wilson my assent. Wilson looked happy too, but the me of that time never imagined that this choice would plunge me into an even deeper hell. When work ended, Wilson approached me. We had promised to head to the bar together. The colleagues around us were starting to head out too. I also headed to the bar with Wilson without thinking much of it. When we arrived at the bar, everyone was already drinking and having a good time. Wilson and I sat in the corner and ordered beers. Wilson said to me in a low voice so no one else could hear, "Mr. Johnson's way of doing things is way too overbearing. Not letting high school graduates do sales is unbelievable." I sighed. I'm sure it's just at the beginning. They don't have enough salesmen either, so it won't continue for long. You think so? I've heard stories before about how he made employees he didn't like quit by not giving them work. What? The more I learned about Mr. Johnson, the more my anxiety grew. I was drinking beer, trying to ease my worries. And then it happened. I saw Mr. Johnson entering the bar from the entrance. He finally came. Everyone stood up and greeted him at once. I also joined in. Then, Mr. Johnson, spotting me, yelled out in a loud voice, "There's an uninvited guest here today." Everyone looked around all at once, with puzzled expressions. And then Mr. Johnson pointed at me. "It's you, Zach. Why are you here? I didn't invite you. High school graduates shouldn't participate in this gathering." Mr. Johnson shouted furiously. When I entered this bar, I had felt something off, and that was the absence of any other high school graduates besides me. It was only then that I learned this get-together was just for college graduates. I stood there dumbfounded. My senior colleagues were desperate to calm Mr. Johnson down. Now, don't say that, let's drink. The alcohol here is delicious." With my senior's assistance, Mr. Johnson settled down and started drinking. When I stood up to leave, my senior colleague stopped me, so I thought I'd drink a bit more before heading home. That's what I thought. But the moment I finished my beer and happened to think of standing up, something cold poured over my head. Looking up in surprise, there was Mr. Johnson with an unpleasant smirk on his face. Shockingly, Mr. Johnson had actually turned a cold beer upside down over my head. Beer dripped down from my hair. I couldn't comprehend what was happening. The people around me seemed unable to hide their shock either. Wilson handed me a handkerchief and asked worriedly, "Are you okay? Does Mr. Johnson want to exclude me so badly that he'd go this far?" I was filled with disbelief. All my colleagues were looking at me with pity in their eyes. I immediately stood up and left the restaurant still drenched. If I stayed together with them any longer, I felt like I'd go crazy. Wilson quickly chased after me out of the restaurant. "I'm sorry for making you go through this unpleasant experience by inviting you." Wilson apologized, looking regretful. But this wasn't Wilson's fault. It's all the fault of Mr. Johnson, who looks down on me to no end. It's my fault for participating without thinking. Don't worry about it. Saying that, I went home. When I got home, my uncle and his wife had come to visit. It had been a while since I last saw my uncle. They were surprised to see me completely drenched, but I lied that it had suddenly started raining and glossed over it. I thought if I told them the truth, my uncle being who he is, he would worry, thinking that I have to go back to that company with that unpleasant Mr. Johnson again tomorrow. My stomach twists in pain. What kind of face should I make when I go to work? The more I thought about it that day, the more my stomach hurt, and I couldn't sleep. And the next day, I went to work sleep deprived. As soon as I arrived at work, Wilson approached me. "You okay?" He seems to be worried about what happened yesterday. I nodded and said, "Yeah, I'll manage somehow," and Wilson looked relieved. Then the next moment, I heard Mr. Johnson's excited voice behind me. Just what in the world happened? I was suspicious. That top tire company, Anderson Motor, sent an offer wanting to have a business meeting with our company. Anderson Motor is a top-class company even within the automobile industry. For a company like that to say they want to do business with us is amazing. And then Mr. Johnson said something shocking. About that business meeting, Anderson's CEO specifically requested you. I can hardly understand why you were chosen either. What? I was so surprised my eyes went wide. I've never even done sales with Anderson Motor, so why me? I couldn't help but find it strange. Wilson, standing next to me, seemed surprised too. It's incomprehensible, but if that's what the other party is saying, you handle it. If we can strike a deal with Anderson Motor, our company's profits will probably more than double. This is a deal that will determine the company's fate, so brace yourself. Understood. I was perplexed, but I'm glad to be interested with such a big job. I immediately started preparing documents. Anderson Motor has currently begun manufacturing and selling electric vehicles, so they probably need my company's electronic components. How should I give the presentation? I worked through trial and error without even taking breaks and completed the documents. When I showed the finished documents to Mr. Johnson, he nodded and said they were good. The document preparations were completed without issue, so all that's left is to wait for the real thing. And on the fated day of the business meeting, I gathered the documents and was about to leave the company. It was then that Mr. Johnson followed after me. I'm anxious with just you going, so I'll accompany you. That's fine, right? Having two people is more reassuring than one, so I readily agreed. Mr. Johnson and I entered the Anderson Motor headquarters building with nervous steps. The receptionist seemed to have been waiting for us and guided us to the reception room. Mr. Johnson and I sat on the sofa and waited for Anderson's CEO to come. During that time, Mr. Johnson kept repeating the same thing over and over. I won't forgive you if you fail. Each time Mr. Johnson said that, I nodded slightly. After a while, Anderson's CEO, Mr. Thompson, entered the reception room. Mr. Johnson and I stood up and greeted him. And then I immediately began explaining the electronic components our company handles. Mr. Thompson listened while nodding. And then he broke into a wide smile, as expected of Mr. Martinez. All right, we'll use your company's electronic components then. Thank you very much. I was so happy my voice cracked. It was the moment my efforts bore fruit. Just as Mr. Thompson was about to sign a contract, Mr. Johnson suddenly uttered a shocking statement. This guy's incompetent, so I'll take over. What? What are you saying? I unintentionally raised my voice. Mr. Johnson hasn't done anything for this business deal. I'm the one who did the research and prepared all the documents. He probably thinks he can take credit for it now that the deal is about to be finalized. There's no way such selfish behavior can be allowed. You're a high school graduate, so shut up. I'm talking to Mr. Thompson. I'm shaking with anger, and my patience finally snapped. Mr. Johnson, you haven't done anything. I'm the one who prepared everything for this deal. When I said that, Mr. Johnson burst out laughing. I'm sure even Mr. Thompson would prefer to have me as the person in charge rather than an incompetent like you. Then the next moment, Mr. Thompson exploded with rage like a raging fire. What are you saying? You think high school graduates are incompetent? Mr. Thompson's sudden shout made Mr. Johnson falter a bit. But Mr. Johnson made another remark, looking down on me. Mr. Thompson, Zach is a high school graduate and an incompetent who can't do his job at all. If I, a graduate of a famous university, become the person in charge of this deal with Anderson, it'll be smooth sailing from here on. Please consider it. How much does he have to look down on people to be satisfied? I'm sure no matter what I say to this person, it'd be pointless. Thinking that, I could only sigh. I was reminded once again that this is what it means to be so appalled you can't even speak. Mr. Thompson seemed to think the same thing as me and was stunned listening to Mr. Johnson's words. But he quietly opened his mouth. Is being a high school graduate really that bad? Mr. Johnson looked a bit surprised at Mr. Thompson's question. He probably never thought he'd be told something like that. As Mr. Johnson stayed silent, Mr. Thompson said something shocking. There are plenty of employees who are high school graduates working hard, and some have even been promoted. I'm one of them myself. Saying that, Mr. Thompson glared at Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson turned pale and started trembling. Is that so? But you have talent, Mr. Thompson, so it's fine even if you're a high school graduate. I was only talking about Zach. Mr. Johnson is desperately trying to retract his earlier remark, but it's a futile effort. Mr. Thompson let out a big sigh. Enough already. I want to do business with Zach. You stay quiet. I don't want to do business with someone who has such an extreme way of thinking. Mr. Johnson still hasn't given up and is talking to Mr. Thompson again. It's way too foolish. Why do you want to make Zach the person in charge of the deal so badly? At that, Mr. Thompson looked surprised. You don't know anything about this person, do you? What? I know plenty about Zach. Zach is a high school graduate who can't do his job properly. Mr. Thompson burst out laughing. You really didn't understand anything after all. I think Zach is more competent than someone like you. Why? Because Zach is the very person who developed several of the products our company handles. The atmosphere in the room froze. Developed Anderson's products. There's no way that's possible. But it is. Our company solicits inventions from the general public once a year. Zach was the one who submitted to it. Zach's ideas were outstanding, and he won the grand prize on his first try. And that's how they were turned into products. Mr. Thompson said that to Mr. Johnson while smiling at me. Mr. Johnson has an unbelieving look on his face. Thank you for your support back then. I'm honored to have won a grand prize multiple times. The reason you were able to win a grand prize multiple times is because you have talent, Zach. Your company's CEO is a lucky man to be able to hire such an excellent employee. I'm jealous. Hearing Mr. Thompson's words, Mr. Johnson is looking at me and Mr. Thompson with wide eyes. Yes, in fact, I've won Anderson's invention contest multiple times. The reason I started submitting to this invention contest was because my uncle recommended it to me. I've loved studying since I was little, and I especially loved science. Knowing that, my uncle said the words that became the impetus for me to invent things. Everything that exists in this world exists because someone invented it. Humans have to go to heaven someday, but things will never disappear for eternity. Why don't you try inventing something like that too, Zach? Those words moved my heart. I see. Things will absolutely never disappear from this world. I'll try inventing things that everyone needs too. That was the beginning. From then on, I devoted myself to inventing things and submitted to Anderson's invention contest. It started as half for fun, but my invention was splendidly awarded a grand prize and turned into a product. Happy about that, I submitted again the next year and the year after that and won a grand prize multiple times. My uncle and mother were overjoyed, and I was proud. As I was reminiscing about the past, Mr. Thompson continued talking. The reason our company said we wanted to have a business meeting with Zach this time is because we found out this electronic component was invented by Zach. Mr. Johnson is even more shocked. Zach developed our company's component. You didn't even know that. Before your company merged, Zach had developed that electronic component and even got a patent for it. In other words, your company needs to have Zach. It's just as Mr. Thompson says. I currently work in the sales department and go to work at the company every day except weekends. But having learned the joy of inventing, I spend my days inventing various things whenever I have time. Before my current company merged, when I was still in my early 20s, I had a chance to talk with a colleague in the product development department. Then that colleague started talking about how an electronic component that fits any machine would definitely sell for a high price. I see. That would certainly be convenient. All right, I'll try developing it. It was with such a light feeling that I started developing the electronic component. And in just 2 months, I succeeded in developing an electronic component that works with any machine. When I talked about this electronic component, my touched colleague reported it to our supervisor. It quickly reached the ears of my company's CEO. The CEO was extremely moved and told me to get her patent. I did as the CEO said. And this electronic component became our company's flagship product. It was before the merger, so it can't be helped if Mr. Johnson doesn't know. Do you understand? Zach is not incompetent at all. Mr. Johnson has completely stopped talking and fallen silent. I couldn't help but thank Mr. Thompson for revealing my true identity. Mr. Thompson, thank you for choosing me as the person in charge. When I said that, Mr. Thompson smiled. No, I've known for a long time that you're a person overflowing with talent, Zach. but there's someone who strongly recommended you. What? I was surprised. This is the first I've heard of there being such a person. And then at that moment, a certain person entered the reception room. I'm the one who recommended Zach. My uncle is looking at me with a wide smile. I'm so surprised I'm at a loss for words. Mr. Johnson's eyes are wide. I couldn't understand why my uncle was here. Chairman. My uncle is the chairman of this company. I looked at my uncle multiple times. You weren't scheduled to attend today's business meeting, right? Your nephew's deal that you recommended was perfect, so we decided to finalize it. When Mr. Thompson said that, my uncle looked happy. I'm glad Zach's deal was a success. Saying that, my uncle put his hand on my shoulder. You're Anderson's chairman. I couldn't help but ask. My uncle nodded with a smile. Sorry for keeping quiet about it. Actually, I'm the one who founded this company. I was speechless. Mr. Johnson can hide his shock and his thoughts are completely transparent. Zach is the chairman's nephew. No way. Seeing that, my uncle glared at Mr. Johnson. Are you the Mr. Johnson who drenched my precious nephew in beer? Mr. Johnson's face has turned blue. How do you know about that? Zach told me. Actually, on the day of that beer incident, my uncle and his wife had come to visit my family home. My uncle saw me completely drenched and was very worried, so I made the excuse that I got wet from the rain. But my uncle immediately said he could smell beer on me. Thinking it would be impossible to keep hiding it, I decided to reveal what Mr. Johnson said. My uncle quietly listened to my story without saying anything. I never could have predicted things would develop like this. Then Mr. Thompson interjected. He did something like that too. Earlier, he was saying high school graduates are incompetent and telling me to make him the person in charge instead. My uncle's face rapidly turned red and his expression became demon-like. But incredibly, Mr. Johnson started making excuses. I do feel bad about drenching him in beer, but it was an accident. It wasn't on purpose. Then my uncle shouted furiously. There are accidents like that. Stop lying. I said I'd have my nephew be in charge of the deal because I wanted to do something for him when he was being unreasonably looked down on. I won't do business with you no matter what. The incompetent one is you, who can only judge people by their academic background. It was the first time I'd seen my usually good-natured uncle get this angry. Mr. Johnson seemed to have lost all strength in his legs and couldn't move from the sofa. And then my uncle took an action no one predicted. I expressed my gratitude to my uncle. My uncle smiled and said, I'm glad I could help you out. I dragged Mr. Johnson, who was completely dejected, back to the company. Then, my company's CEO, Mr. Davis, suddenly entered the office, and he raised his voice at Mr. Johnson. It was so sudden that everyone's gazes were immediately drawn to Mr. Johnson and Mr. Davis. I was told by Anderson's chairman that Mr. Johnson looks down on his subordinates for being high school graduates and that he should be demoted. Is that true? Mr. Davis asked half-doubtingly. My uncle, worried about me, probably told Mr. Davis the truth. It seemed like something my uncle would do, and I laughed a little. Mr. Johnson, his face pale and body trembling, is spouting lies again. There's no such fact. But the next moment, my colleagues including Wilson stood up and yelled out. Mr. Johnson's pet phrase is that high school graduates are incompetent, and his attitude toward his subordinates is deplorable. Please demote him. We beg you. We can't work with Mr. Johnson any longer. What? The office was in an uproar. Then Mr. Davis cleared his throat loudly. Understood. Let's demote Mr. Johnson. Department heads who make their subordinates say things like that are usually the worst kind of people. Everyone. I'm sorry I didn't realize. Mr. Davis apologized to us. Mr. Johnson collapsed to his knees on the spot. I'm being demoted. Mr. Johnson was at a complete loss for who knows how long. After that, Mr. Davis officially demoted Mr. Johnson. Unable to accept the demotion, the prideful Mr. Johnson ended up voluntarily resigning from the company. Mr. Johnson left saying loudly, even if I quit this company, I have countless places to work. There are tons of companies that need me. But I heard through the grapevine that he still hasn't found a new job, and even his wife ran out on him. It's probably the result of him looking down on people so much until now. I think he should be grateful if he can live on his hands and knees. and I'm still working energetically at the peaceful company after Mr. Johnson left. One thing that's changed is that I was promoted to sales department head. I'm living busy but fulfilling days. From now on, I intend to keep walking through life surrounded by the people I love, doing what I want,